Hello, my name is Milorad, and today I'm going to be discussing changes and new considerations for Utgard in Dominion 6. I know it's been some time since my last video, like maybe a month. I just had like too many real life things going on to play a lot of Dominions, so I didn't want to put out a video until I had played enough to kind of know what I'm talking about. For Utgard. So, before I discuss Utgard too much, I want to explain that I'm coming to this video with a little bit of a bias. Um, you know, I like Scales Utgard from Dominions 5. I know a lot of people do the Hell Bless on the Garmherding. Um, with the Blood Bond and the Regeneration and maybe even the Fortitude. Uh, but I've never been like big on Hell Blessing um, when you have so many good Scales troops in this nation. But that's just my personal style of. So when I'm discussing this, it might have a little bit more of that bias showing. Anyway, okay, so first of all, let's discuss the scales and economy. Every nation, of course, now can only do +2 in most categories. Um, that's sort of a problem for Utgard for two reasons. Like, now you cannot go slot 3 if unless you take a pretender that has a additional sloth. If you're gonna dump scales to try to do a Hell Bless for Garm herding. On the other side, conversely, if you want to go really big production in order to make scales troops, because a lot of them, like the good ones, are intensive in both resources and recruitment points, right? Um, so you also cannot go now order 3, production 3, unless you have scales for the pretenders. But there's not as many options. Um, Interestingly, one thing, the cold, for thematic reasons, yes, you can go cold 3, where many nations cannot. But keep in mind two things about this. First of all, you do not have the population loss protections in your forts that some of the other nations in this cultural line have in the earlier ages. So if you go cold 3 in a winter, you may go up to cold 4 in some provinces, and you will not be protected from population loss. However, that's maybe not that big of a deal because it's only part of the year. The other consideration, this was also true in Dominions 5, is that your human troops, if you're going to use them, they do not have a snow move. So, they're already slow. Like maybe these are like 12, but like with no snow move, they're gonna go down slower, and the same is true for the mages, the human ones. Um, Luck is interesting. I assume this is for some kind of thematic or mythological reason that I'm not aware of that has something to do with the Norse mythology, but like I don't know why this is considered a lucky nation. If you think about it, like lore-wise, this seems the Scrati are always getting screwed over by somebody, so like I'm not sure why they're considered a lucky nation. From a gameplay perspective, luck 3 is usually good, but it pairs best, in my opinion, with turmoil. But in this nation, I don't see why you would want to go turmoil 3 on this nation, or even turmoil 2, because all of your troops really, with the exception of the humans, like this one, and then like some of the giants, but even this, like, yes, the ratio of resources is twice that of the recruitment points, but you still need recruitment points. um, so I wouldn't want to go heavy turmoil on this nation because your giant troops are also resource point intensive. So the luck, yes, you can go, order one, order neutral, and still have luck and benefit from it if you want to do that. Um, and they have some interesting heroes too. So you may want to go luck 3. Okay. Okay, so moving on now to first we're going to talk about the troops, and then we'll talk about the mages, because the troops are going to be a much shorter discussion. As far as I can tell, none of the troops have really changed in equipment and statistics except for their size. This is relevant because, in Dominions 5, um, you could fit one human with one giant in the same square to reduce how many times a giant is targeted, as well as increased number of attacks per square. So that's still true in Dominions 6, that they can share each of them a square. But there's a new consideration in that now the giants, because they are 3 sizes larger than the humans, they will displace them. Whereas in Dominions 5, they would get stuck. One giant would get stuck behind a square of 3 humans and have to wait for 2 of them to die before he can take a space. Now, you would have to put the humans in the back usually, but they're so slow, like a combat speed versus the giants, right? Well, maybe these are not a good example, like this one. Okay, but the point is, the humans would they would have to be in the back, so they would have to, and they're slower, so they would take more time for them to catch up with the front line. Now, because of the concept of displacement with size differential, you can put a line of these in the front, for example, and have them throw their javelins, and then the Jotun troops will come in from behind and displace the humans to take their space. So that gives you more tactical flexibility when you're making the scripting. This is also true with Skelly Spam, because in Dominions 5, the Sith Conan, of course, was like a heavy Skelly Spam in Communions. The skeletons would flood the whole field, and then sometimes the giants would get stuck behind them. Sometimes you didn't want that, because often the skeletons can't hit anything. Well, they cannot do enough damage, whereas the giants can. But now, the giants can kind of move forward through the skelly spam, because the skeletons are all size 3 as well. So it gives you more tactical flexibility there. Okay, so now moving on to the mages and commanders. This is the biggest change. It's quite dramatic, actually. I was a little shocked when I first saw it. Okay, so in Dominions 5, this was 1 astral, 1 death, 1 nature. Now the nature is swapped for glamour. This is good and bad. Obviously, it opens up new doors and closes others. The classic way to play in Dominions 5 was that you had a Sith Kona casting in a communion regeneration with a nature, and then they would just spam skeletons, and then the Scrati would be the slaves, right? And they would benefit from the regeneration, because in their second form they also have a built-in regeneration and would stack. Now you can't do that. Even before discussing the changes with Sabbaths and communions, even if the old rules still applied, you could not cast a regeneration, because the Sith Kona doesn't have it, nature. You would have to use the Norna 1 in 5, right? So that's a big change. But it also opens up some glamour spells that you didn't previously have, because glamour didn't exist. Scrati, now he loses his random for nature entirely and replaces it with glamour. And then Norna, used to be the same pass here, but it was 1 nature instead of 1 glamour. now the nature is only 1 in 5 random. So you're really not a nature nation anymore, in any sense of the word. I mean, you lost it on 2 of your mages, and then the Norna can only get 1. Um, so what this means is that you're really now more of a glamour death astral nation. Well, and blood, of course. So you now the Norna cannot get to nature like she could in Dominions 5 and build a booster. Now you have to have a booster from a hero or a pretender in order to get higher nature. Um, Furthermore, the existence of an additional random dilutes the paths. So if you really desperately want um, a blood, for example, it's now less likely. It's only 20% instead of 25. Um, okay, so the big issue here is oh, one more thing about the Scrati before I move on to the other discussion is that now they changed in Dominions 6 that if he shapeshifts, he doesn't lose all his items. That was a big problem in Dominions 5. You had to like bring a scout with them if you're going to be thugging, or if they change shape, they would lose some of their slots in the smaller wolf shape. But that's no longer the case. Now those are just like blanked out that you can't use them until you go back to the proper shape. Excuse me. Okay, so now the huge issue, the big elephant in the room, as they say, is that you can no longer mix a communion with a Sabbath. And that's a huge problem because, as I mentioned earlier, before you would do this, like, 2 Scrati could support like 8 Sith Conan in a Turbo Communion because of their regeneration. Now, how are you going to form it, right? The Sith Conan does not have access to blood. The Scrati does not have access to astral. So, the only way to do it is with items. Or 1 in 5 Norna can get to blood. But then you're not gonna, like, okay, so 1 in 5 Norna, you're gonna have, she can do a Sabbath with the Scrati, but then you're losing, like, now you have one mage doing instead of what a bunch of Seth Conan would do in Dominions 5. So now you have to fix this with items. But it's hard because you don't have earth astral paths to make a communion matrix, right? You don't have that on your nation. You have to put it on a pretender. And then if it's only one pretender is making one at a time, that's not easy to do. What you could do instead, these are new items, is that well, this is a new item, but it doesn't really help your problem. Okay, so you have a Sabbath slave. This is Slave's Heart at Construction 5. You can make this. It's not easy to make though because you have to boost your blood. It gives you an innate Sabbath slave, but that's not really going to help your situation. You really have to wait until you get to Construction 7 to make Master Athame, and then your Sith Konas can carry this to be the Sabbath Master to Scrati. But it's expensive to make, and you don't have these paths without empowering in blood, unless you take it on your pretender, and it's all the way in Construction 7. So, goodbye Turbo Communions for this nation without a lot of extra work, whereas before it was very simple to do. So that's a huge new consideration for this nation, and we'll talk more about it maybe when we get to the spells. But I cannot stress enough how impactful that is. Okay, let's now briefly talk about summons and heroes before we talk about spells and blesses. Okay, with the summons. So this is the mod Better National Overview by Sturm. I was a little confused about this one because I don't remember them having access to the Jarl on Dominions 5. So I went and tested it with the debug sensei in 6. I cast the Ill Winter and I still couldn't make them out of any fort. And if you go to what's the national spells, like yes, there's Ill Winter, but like I don't see anywhere to make the Neefel, right? So like this was access to like earlier versions of this nation. So I think this is a mistake, or I'm missing something, um, which is too bad because it would be helpful for you to have this on your nation, but you don't. I don't think so. Okay, so the Jotun wolves are kind of like, yes, you have access to this, but how are you gonna cast it? Because in Dominions 5, you had a 1 in 4 random on a Norna was a nature 2, and she could make a Thistle Wand and give it to any Sithkona, and they could cast the Brood of Gram, right? Now you have no more higher access than nature 1 natively. You have to have it on your pretender or some other way, or with the hero. So it's harder to cast this. It gives even less use for the wolves, which sucks because there's a sacred with 2 attacks. Um, I think that the sacred now that is more relevant is actually the Glozo, because in Dominions 5, um, you really wouldn't use this that much for 2 reasons. One, they were size 3, so they couldn't fit in with the giants. Now they can, because they're size 4, and the giant is 6. The other thing is that the heat aura would damage your giants. Now, in Dominion 6, they change how a heat aura works. It's weaker, like it spreads out further, but it's weaker, right? In cold 2 or 3, if you take that, the heat aura will basically do nothing to friendly troops. So you can, pretty safely mix these in with the giants if you want to. But in that case, you're really only using this unit for the fact that you have a poison on the attack and that it's sacred. So if you do have a bless that's offensive, or has like a fear, for example, you might want to make a glosso. Whereas I think I almost never use this in Dominions 5. Okay, moving on to the heroes. This is the same as far as I can tell. So still like your highest access to, or your only access to air. These have all changed though, because now you have access to glamour. So they all give you at least glamour 3, which is important because they can make a booster hat. The Glossamer Veil. So if you don't have it on your pretender, which is important because you are now a glamour nation. However, on the other hand, this one used to be in nature 4, and now she's only 3. So if you want to put up Mother Oak, for example, now you have to do it with the pretender, whereas in Dominions 5, because she was nature 4, you could give a Thistle Wand to her and then she could cast it. So just a new consideration. But these mages, I think, are important because there are lots of nature glamour cross-path spells, so that they may be important for rituals. Okay. Alright, let's move on to the spells. So like on my other videos, I'm only going to be talking about spells that are new or that have significantly changed that are relevant to this nation, because otherwise this video will go on for way too long. So under Conjuration, I'm mostly going to be talking about Glamour, because that's what you have now access to. So Phantasmal Warrior and Phantasmal Wolves are interesting because they can fit in with your giant troops because they're small enough. And unlike Illusion, they are ethereal, but they have a health points, more than 1, right? So, and they can apply false damage. So these are useful, and it's easy to make the glamour spool to give you one temporary gem to keep casting this over and over because it's a cheap item. You have access to the Glamour Water Crosspath, but keep in mind, if you make a Water Kobold, he can only sail size 5 and smaller, so he can't sail any of your giants. But maybe if you're still using human troops for some reason, you haven't transitioned to using like a skeletons and illusions, maybe you need the humans for something else. He can sell them around because they're quite slow, especially if you have a cold. um, Fey Prince is interesting for this nation because normally you want uh, the cold temperature ones, in my opinion, because they give you access to death, glamour, crosspath. However, for this nation, you have tons of death glamour. You don't need that. What you need is more glamour nature crosspath because only 1 in 5 Norna has it. So if you have access to a warm temperature forest, you may want to cast a Fey Prince so you can have another mage that has a nature glamour crosspath because that's an important crosspath. um, Ice Drakes. So this is more important or more interesting than ever for this nation because, you know, yes, they were also useful in Dominions 5 because all your giants have a 15 cold protection, so they're basically immune to the Drake Frost, right? Um, this unit has changed somewhat in Dominion 6. So now he no longer has ammunition. He does a fatigue when he blows his breath, right? Uh, Furthermore, it's a size 6 now. So for some nations, the Drake will displace the skeletons, for example, for Skelly Spam, and can run forward because it's undisciplined, and it maybe doesn't do what you want. Like it's trying to breathe on the wrong target, so it just runs forward through your skeletons and gets killed. Whereas that would not have happened in Dominions 5. But with the Jotun nations, um, including Utgard, because the giants are size 6, the Drake cannot run past them. It also can't share a square, so it will safely sit behind the giants and spray the frost without getting into melee. And you have a earlier access to the Dragon Mastery item if you take a Earth Water crosspath, and then your Scrotty who randoms water can wear the hat, and he can cast 2 drakes for every cast. Okay, moving on to Alteration. Obviously, Twilight is great for this nation because you're going to be doing heavy communions. I don't think the Blur is super useful on the Giants because they're not really relying on their defense. Um, you know, they're relying on killing things very quickly or using a repel with size 4 spears, right? Like defense is not as important. So you might want to cast it, but I don't think it's really worth it. Invisibility is interesting in a communion because it affects a caster. So this gives you unseen, like the Naba and Ubar Jin. So it's like a -10, I think, if you don't have a spirit sight or true sight to the attack. So if you're using communion slaves in an offensive way, where they're like the slaves are in the front, so they're coming into contact with the enemy, like the linebacker is what it's called, right? Um, unfortunately, you can't use the Scrotty as easily for this, because it would be great on them because they have such high health points and regeneration. But regardless of who you're using for a slave, whether it's a Sitkona or a Scrotty, this is a great ability to put on them because it will make it harder for the enemy to get past the communion slaves that are in like a blocking role, because unless they have a true sight. Okay. Moving on to evocation. So interestingly enough, I found in my test play that this is more important than you would think compared to um, Dominions 5, right? Like, I don't remember really using Evocation that much, but there's two reasons now that Evocation is more important. One is Glamour, and one is Death. So with Glamour, um, the Warrior Illusions, this used to be with Air, which you do not have access to, but now it's with Glamour. So this creates a size 3 that can fit in with your giants. It's ethereal. So this is an alternative to skeletons as chaff to fill the squares if your enemy is doing banishment. Um, Also, these do, false damage, so they actually do something as compared to the illusions in Dominions 5, which really were just there to block. Um, Dance of Swords is something else interesting if you're going to be using Communion Slaves in an offensive blocking role, because it does attacks, um, even if they're passed out. Okay, and then Illusory Army and Ghost Wolves are another way to make illusions in addition to Warrior Illusion. Um, okay, for Death, so Shadow Bolt is now Area of Effect 1. Bolt of Unlife is now Area of Effect 1. And Blast of Unlife is now 2 instead of 1. Um, so this gives more reason to maybe want to do Death offensively instead of just casting Skeletons. Because, that's predictable. There's ways to counter it. Now in a Communion, they can cast these attacks, right, without gems. And it's armor negating MR check, right? Now, with the friendly fire, you have to consider that your giants, even before you put up Spell Ward, which you have access to easily on this nation, they have a higher than average MR. So they will be able to, like tank the MR checks better if there's being friendly fire, and they have a lot of health points. So like uh, a lot of these death evocations, they're not enough to kill the giants. Like even if it does 15 armor negating damage, like the giant has like 30 something health points, so it's not going to kill him. So if you're fighting like a human size opponents, especially if they don't have a very good MR, this would be great to spray like all of these like offensive death spells, because your giants have a better than average chance to negate them, and even if they're hit, it won't likely kill them. um, Interesting enough, also with there's been a small change to nether bolts and nether darts. This used to be MR negates, right? Now it's difficult MR negates. Um, so this is even more reason to maybe want to use these spells, especially if you have, since it scales with Astral instead of Death, if you have a large communion with Power of Spheres and Light of the Star, you can get, quite high scaling damage. And again, because your giants have a higher MR, it's easier for them to pass the check, even if it's a difficult MR. And because it's armor piercing and not armor negating, a lot of your giants have like between 17, 19, 20 armor, and they have a lot of HP, so you're not going to suffer so much from friendly fire if you're spraying around nether spells. So there's actually more reason to maybe want to go up Evocation, whereas I feel like you really wouldn't even consider that so much um, in previous games. Okay, just looking at my notes. With construction, I already talked about some of these, but like once again, like some important items that are new, I would consider is the shaman staff. Like if you have a Norna if you have a nature Norna a nature random Norna. She can make this, and it gives a new way to get penetration besides the um, Rune Smasher. And this is available very early. And that's good if you're going to be using the spells we just talked about in Evocation that are MR negate. Um, in Construction 5, we talked about this Dragon Mastery. Now, you don't have these paths, but you might want to put on your Pretender if you're going to be using Ice Drakes, because you get 2 for 1. This is also, again, where the Slave Heart is, which is new. And then under 7, again, as we talked about before, you have the Master Athame if you're going to be using Scratis in Communions. Okay, and again, I'm sure I'm missing some stuff. I'm trying to move relatively quickly, so it's not like a hour and a half video. Under Enchantment, again, mostly talking about new spells. So with Glamour, this is Horrible Visage is interesting if you're going to be using, again, your slaves in a blocking role. Because it gives a way to chase the enemy away through Dread. So you can pretty easily cast this. Again, this would be exceptionally good on a Scrati if you were able to get them into the Communion later in the game, because they have such high HP and regeneration. They're going to stay around for a long time and chase away a lot of the enemies trying to attack them. Nightmare Masks is the only way to put them on your troops. This is very hard to cast. Yes, you can do it if you have Twilight and a Communion, or even like without a Communion if you have a booster on a Norna. Dread, like, I don't think I would put this on most nations that have this cross path, like Machaka, for example. But this one, the Giants have a lot of HP, and they have good armor, so they'll stay around long enough for the Dread to do something. The only problem is because it's only AoE 5, you're only going to hit 5 individual Giants because they only fit 1 in a square. So it may not be worth it. Bewilderment is interesting, again, for your Communion slaves if you're going to be using them in an offensive blocking way, because this can stack with Unseen or Displaced Body, whereas the other ones cannot, right? Like it says invisibility will not stack with Blur, but it doesn't say that here for Bewilderment. Okay. You know, Spell Ward got changed. Now, like, or sorry, that's a new. Anti-Magic is all the way down to 7, but you can still do a lower level Spell Ward, which is important if you're going to be using a lot of MR negates evocations. Also, you can give Spirit Sight if it's relevant, but it's such a low area effect that you're literally point buffing individual giants. Okay, Thaumaturgy. Okay, so several interesting spells I want to highlight that are relevant for you. Mind Blank for Communions, very important. Plus 10 MR is huge. And you have this Mind Duel, Magic Duel thing if you're going to have your Nornas targeted, especially, but keep in mind that they'll get feeble-minded. As far as like luck, group luck is amazing on many nations, but it's not as good for you for 2 reasons. One, AoE is very small, so you're literally just hitting like 3 or 4 giants. Furthermore, you don't want to put luck on high HP units, because then they'll get hit forever, and they'll get a bunch of afflictions. You want to put more luck on low HP units. That way they're luck tanking the enemy, as opposed to here, like, your giants will maybe survive, but then they'll have a ton of afflictions. So probably not use a group luck. I think offensive spells that are good here are the sleep spells like Slumber, Um, and Sandman's Blessing is especially good. And this is very hard to cast if you don't have access to Glamour in a Communion or a Sabbath. You have a very easy access to Glamour in a Communion. So, like for example, Norna, if she's a master, if she has a random 2 Glamour, she can pretty easily cast this inside of a Communion, especially if she has a booster or she has the Glamour hat boost, or she has a Twilight up. Um, and this is such a huge area of effect. And your giants have, like we said, higher than average MR. So if you have, and it doesn't affect undead or mindless. So if you have giants mixed in with skeletons or illusions, and you spray the sleep spells that have huge area of effect, it's unlikely to get many of your troops, but it will be very effective against the opponent. And even if it doesn't hit all of them, anything that helps to lower the number of attacks against your giants is a good thing. um, Unending Nightmare, I don't feel like is as good, because what it does is it does sleep, and then when they wake up, they're confused. But I don't feel like confusion is like particularly good. Um, I would rather have, you know, for these paths, I would rather have somebody casting Slumber, because you're going to end up doing a higher area of effect than this one. That's just my opinion. But maybe you want to have the confusion effect. Okay, and then in Blood, um, one of the ones I wanted to highlight is that's changed is Serpent Fiend, right? This is now mage turn efficient in a way that it wasn't as much in Dominions 5, because in Dominions 5 you get 1 a turn, 1 per cast. I mean, now you get 3. It is more expensive, but it's still more efficient. Serpent Fiends are better than they were in Dominions 5 for 2 reasons. One is because they're a size 4, they can fly and fit in a square with a giant, whereas they could not in Dominions 5 because they were size 3 and the giant was size 4. Furthermore, they have a death poison, which they also did in Dominions 5 on their bite. However, now, because the poison debuffs stats, like on a human size unit, if you have a death poison take effect, he will lose almost half his statistics before the poison kills him, which is important in making your giants even more effective fighters. So you may want to cast these. Okay. All right, let's move on to the blesses. Again, I'm only be talking about new blesses or like newly relevant blesses for this nation. So, you know, looking at these, the very first one that jumped out to me, is Enchanted Blood. Um, because first it gives you +1 magic resistance, but more importantly, it gives you that passive regen. You could pair this, for example. So, like, the classic Gum Herding Bless is, of course, Regeneration, Blood Bond, and Fortitude, right? Or maybe no Blood Bond and just do Regeneration, Fortitude, and Magic Weapons, right? Now, you can take Enchanted Blood and Blood Bond if you wanted to, whereas in Dominions 5, I mean, there was no Enchanted Blood, but let's say it did exist in Dominions 5, you would need a Blood 9 Pretender, but now you don't, because of how they've changed how blesses work. So I think Enchanted Blood will work well on both a Garm Herding and, more importantly, on a Sabbath or Communion Slave who's wearing a Shroud, because it boosts their passive regen, right? As far as so that's like a defensive one. As far as the other ones, we got a lot of new weapon blesses. You have to consider the fact that you have only one recruitable sacred who has 1 attack that hits extremely hard. So why would you put, for example, slowing weapons on a Garm herding when he's gonna kill basically everything he hits? So the proccing is useless. Similarly, vampiric weapons, like this only gives you the health points if the drain life has to take effect afterwards, right? So he'll just kill most things he hits. It's not really worth it. And then you have to look at whether your other sacred units. You have the wolf, yes, but it's harder than ever to cast them. And you have the Glozzo, but he only has one attack. So it's probably not worth doing a weapon bless on this nation. Something that might work is Dread. Um, because you have Berserker Sacreds, meaning they will not run in most cases. So, and they're hard to kill, especially if you have a regeneration on them. Uh, the Dread will make it even harder for with the Berserker and Dread combined. It's even harder for your enemy to get rid of them before they all rout. This would also give some use case to your Glozzos, um, because then they have value just by existing. They don't have to really worry about fighting. Um, Maybe Awe as well, uh, because it gives another way for your Garm herding to defend himself besides repelling, um, or regeneration, because then it gives you +3 Awe. Whereas in Dominion's 5, this would have only been +1. So, I was looking at this. I'm not sure what else. I mean, perhaps you could be like really crazy and do flight, because flying Garm herdings would be funny. But that's gonna work once to shock your opponent, and then they're gonna realize what you're doing, and then you have this huge bless that's really otherwise kind of wasted, in my opinion, for 9 bless points. Um, okay, I'm sure someone else can think of something better that maybe I didn't. But that's really all I have for right now. If you have any comments, corrections, or anything else, please put them in the comments to the video. And thank you again for watching my video.